I really appreciate you listening to the podcast here. Let's go get started. It is August 11th. Sorry, it's just going so fast, but I'm happy to have you here with me today. And I'm also thrilled to announce it's officially Sweet 100 tomato season, in which I grow gazillions because I have so many volunteer plants coming up because I grew gazillions last year and the squirrels and the birds help spread the seeds. So there are Sweet 100 tomatoes growing everywhere in my front yard, which looks like you might expect it to look a little bit like I just got out of the trailer. But the good news is tomatoes, I love them. I love them. I love them. And every child that comes down my street, I make them pick one and look at them and taste them. They're so fun. I love cherry tomatoes. Anyway, very happy about that and brought in my first 3 pumpkins because the gophers accelerated that process. So I already have pumpkins in the house and they're sitting with my mom's ashes and it's everything. I just love it. I didn't think I would like that. I thought ashes would be weird, but they're not because it so feels like my mom that she's in the cheapest container available, because if we had spent money on a container, she would have haunted me all my days. This is not at all what this podcast is about today, but I just had to share a little personal news as I am wont to do. Anywho, I'm bringing to you live the Speaker's power and why it matters. Yesterday, we talked about the role of the Speaker of the House and how it's come from what was in British Parliament the Speaker of the House of Commons, where they are essentially like a traffic director and make sure things are safe, to where we have today in America, our Speaker is actually affiliated with the party and has political power. And that is what we're going to talk about today, because as I dug into this topic, and you guys know me, I get so excited about something and then I research it and then I ask more questions. And frankly, I'm going to tell you, I like Copilot on Microsoft because I can go get citations, which matter to me, just helping me do the research. I do like AI in that it helps me do research faster because I can ask it more contextual questions than I can ask Google. So although I've been getting better at asking Google contextual questions as well, but I swear it's fire in some of the other places where I just need citations. I like proof. I like to know that I'm not making stuff up. So this subject gets me excited, and I'm looking ahead at what's coming. I finally got the dates nailed down for the Democratic Convention. It's going to start a week from tomorrow and conclude on Thursday night of next week, not this coming week, but the week after. So I'm going to try this week to talk about the things that one might notice at a convention. It happens to be the Democratic Convention. We know I am on team Kamala, but that doesn't matter because what I'm trying to do here, I mean, it matters to me, but it doesn't matter in the context of this podcast, because really what I'd like to do is help you know what to look for in a convention and what the norms are around conventions and how they work. So we're going to tackle that in this week ahead so that when we come into Monday, we're prepared. And I'm even going to bring some of my rhetorical background into how to listen to speeches and stuff, because if you've never done it before and you don't know some of the ways we rhetoricians look at things, why not learn about it? That's why you're on this journey with me, right? Because we're all learning stuff together. So super fun. So yesterday we explored the evolution and history of the Speaker, but today we're going to talk about the pros and cons of the current powers and some of what's happened with the speakership. And there's a bunch of things they can do that can either make things go really well or really poorly. So, as we know, this position is not ceremonial. It's a central figure in our democracy, and it has significant influence over the legislative process, right? So we have 3 branches of government: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. And I apologize if you're hearing any of the Invisalign coming through. I can't decide if they're better on or off because they put these attachments on my teeth, and it feels like I constantly have flour tortillas stuck in all the cracks of my mouth. It's so weird. But hey, I'm getting it done, and I'm doing it because my teeth were starting to crash together. So, and I can say, I know there's you have many choices in the dental community of how to straighten your jacked teeth. And I honestly didn't comparison shop because I'm like, just get this done. I couldn't stand on my teeth. They were smacking each other, actually. So I apologize if there's any slurring. Okay, focus, Jen, focus. Here we go. So understanding the power of this role today is really important. The speaker can shape the legislative agenda. So any laws we're trying to pass, they pass through the speaker's hands in the House. It's very important. They determine which bills get a vote. They determine how they want to influence in their party strategy. They pull together their caucus, and they talk. There's so much more we have to cover, but they pull together their like-minded people who are going to help them go influence for legislation. A speaker can pull together the caucus. A speaker can go query different caucuses within the big caucus. So those are subgroups within the main group. So if the big caucus is the Republicans, and then the sub caucuses would be the Tea Party people and the I don't even know my branches of Republican Party anymore with the caucuses. On the Democratic side, you see a lot more smaller caucuses, like the progressives. You have people that have they use the young bucks like AOC and some of those. They put them together. The Democratic Party really does tend to have more smaller caucuses because they're trying to really honestly represent, which I got to take that at face value. That is a high-minded ideal. And that is the right ideal for governing, which is to represent your constituents. So, anywho, the speaker can roll up all the caucuses and bring them together and decide how they're going to go message something and how they're going to go get it done. That's particular if that's legislation they're sponsoring. They can also do that to derail legislation. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if we take a look at this role, we can really understand how it will influence what happens to you and me in our daily lives. So this was really important to me, is to understand how the speaker's role affects our lives as individuals. And it's because of the decisions and actions they take can make a big difference in these ways. Number one, it can prioritize certain laws. They get to decide what comes to vote. So if they don't want to talk about something, they don't have to bring it to vote. I almost said a bad word. It's crap. I don't think that's governing, but it's absolutely what you can do. They can influence national debates by setting the priorities for what everybody's going to talk about. One thing we've seen very effective in the GOP, I don't know how it works, but it's, as a messaging person, I'm always blown away by it. I think they all get up at 3 a.m. I think somebody sends out the message for the day, and it literally goes to everybody who could possibly be in front of a camera, and they all have the same message. Whether you like the message or not is separate. But what I've always been impressed with is, man, those folks wake up every day. That grouping of people will wake up every day and be on message. And that is something that the Democratic Party's never had a lot of success at. I think it's because we are, by our nature, factions of interests. And so it's hard to get everybody to be able to take their interest and map it. So that's what you do in messaging. You map your message to the bigger, it's like a step ladder, like it ladders up to the next message and the next. So you could be a top-down messenger. I usually work in brand messaging. So I'm usually at the top trying to message the brand value, the mission, the differentiators, those kinds of things when you think about a brand. And then under that comes people in service marketing, product marketing, all those layers underneath. They need to make sure their messages map up, and I need to make sure I'm providing enough air cover for them so that can work. So that's a lot what a Speaker of the House does, is they provide that air cover on what the discussion's going to be. And those debates and the country's direction on those debates really matter to all of us, because those are things. Now this is when we talk about the issues like healthcare and education or economic and foreign policy. If they don't agree on what the top issues are with you, if they don't agree with you, you're not going to see the stuff you care about get laws that help support the thing you care about. So we can all care about healthcare, but we can have different opinions about how we want to do it. But sometimes we don't even all agree on the fundamentals of healthcare, like healthcare is an American right. Is it? I don't know. I don't know if we have agreement on that. You can pursue life, liberty. What is it? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you can't get a COVID shot so that you can avoid getting COVID, can you really pursue life, liberty? I mean, these things, they're very complicated. That is like such an unfair example because there's layers and layers, but that's actually the point. The point is, if you think about how all these things ladder or connect to one another, sometimes we forget to agree on the basic messaging or the basic premise. So I often ask yourself when you're arguing, Are we arguing about, I'm going to use a metaphor, like a big toe? Or are we arguing that maintaining a heartbeat's really important? I know that was a bad example because I just use healthcare, but my point is you can focus on the big toe or you can focus on, are we going to keep the organism alive? And that's where we as individuals in our democracy really need to be clear what's important to us and how we're influencing, and if we're influencing on the right things. So just hold that, think about that with your values and the things you care about. Think if we're focused on the right things around that. Okay, now I'm going to move on because now I'm going to talk about what it is that the speaker can do that really can have a big impact on how legislation moves through the House and then onto the Senate. So, okay, let's talk about the Speaker of the House, not just a legislative leader today, but a key player on the national political stage as well. So we know today our speakers of the House. We've had Kevin McCarthy, we've had Nancy Pelosi, we've had Mike Johnson, we have had Tip O'Neill, and we have had, I can't even remember them all, but I'm going to give you some examples in here. Paul Ryan, John Sununu. We had so many people. Okay, these speakers, not John Sununu. I don't think, that's not who I meant to say. But we've had many speakers, John Boehner's who I meant to say. We've had many speakers of the House, and they've all, in modern times, which is a weird thing to say, but in recent times, and now, in whatever this is now, they have become a very, very political figure in our national discussion. So here's where the House speakership becomes this double-edged sword, because on one hand, it provides the essential leadership and direction for the House of Representatives, but on the other hand, it can contribute to gridlock, partisanship, vitriol, and just plain bleh. And a lot of Americans really can get frustrated about this. In fact, my personal opinion in watching politics over my lifetime is that when things aren't moving, when people take these I'm not going to move, I'm not going to listen, and I'm not going to change my mind positions, is when Americans shut down on politics. Like, we don't get it. It just feels, it makes us feel so powerless, helpless, and frankly angry. So I think that is another way to understand how someone as important as the Speaker of the House could literally affect your daily mood if they're just shutting. Like, I know every time we come up on a budget, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, every time there's a budget crisis and we're running out of money and my brain doesn't understand, because that's not how it works in our houses, but somehow it works in our government. And then everybody decides they're not going to vote and we're just going to shut it all down. Well, first of all, I can't even imagine the ignorance of that. Anytime you shut something down, there's going to be unintended consequences that are just bad. And ain't nobody got time for that. I can't even imagine just shutting it down. So we've seen a lot of antics go on around our budgets passing. But that's a place where you can disengage the voters, us peoples, very quickly by just having that kind of attitude. It doesn't make anybody feel good, and it can really disenfranchise voters. So that's why I really want to talk about the House speakership, because there's things they do. I think if you understand what they're doing, it might help you be a little more patient, and it will also help you know how to influence because you understand the tactic, right? So one of the tactics is whipping the vote. One of the things a speaker can do that's really powerful, and this, man, I've got an example for you, and you're going to know the name. The speaker's duties include setting the agenda and appointing members to committees. So we've seen that. It's unfortunately now being used as a privilege and a punishment. Committee work should not be a privilege and a punishment. It's usually aligned with seniority and areas of expertise, but instead it's become this ridiculous thing. It's new in like the last 8 years. So, but the job is to whip the vote. So they put people on committees, and you can imagine they can kind of load balance the committees in such a way that they know their legislation will pass, or their better arguers are on one committee, or their better lawyers are on another, that sort of thing. We have an example of where this worked. This is the one I think everybody knows. When Nancy Pelosi was Speaker and we had the Affordable Care Act and it was being debated, she played a crucial role in rallying support. She appointed key committee members to shape the bill, so she even knew who her good influencers were that would help shape this bill. And she knew how to represent the House position in negotiations with the Senate and President Obama. So after the House passes the bill, it's got to keep going, and we'll talk about that because we want to look at the Senate next. But it has to then move on to the Senate, where hopefully it's ratified or shut down. And if it's ratified, it goes on to the president for signature. So there's a good example of whipping the vote and really knowing where her votes were for the Affordable Care Act. That's how that worked, even though it was contentious. The next thing they can do is they can decide what to bring to the floor. We've talked about this a little bit, but they can control what gets a vote. And this power can advance the majority party's agenda or block legislation that the speaker opposes. So an example in 2014 was when John Boehner used his control over the House floor to prevent a vote on immigration reform. And it had significant bipartisan support, but he didn't like it. And because of that, and I suspect, who did John Boehner work for? I suspect it was in line with what, I think that was, wasn't that Baby Bush? I think that was, 2014, that 2014, oh my gosh, that's during Obama. So yes, Speaker, the House was different from, our House was not aligned with the presidency in terms of party, which is another big thing to talk about. When your Speaker of the House is different. We talked about that a bit yesterday. In this case, John Boehner is there during the Obama years. That's 2014. So he doesn't want it to move forward. And he had the power to make it not happen, which is a big deal. Again, it's interesting. It can really disenfranchise if the party in power, like when Trump's in power, and if the party has a House that's opposite, it can disenfranchise voters because if they don't understand what's happening, it feels like nothing is happening. And that's not good for the democracy when it doesn't feel like anything's happening. It should feel like something's happening, and it should feel like our leaders are able to get together and discuss things and take things off the table if it can't happen yet because we're not ready. Figure out the middle ground. Okay, another thing the Speaker can do is reinforce the administration's priorities. So this you see typically happening when you have alignment between the administration, Republican, let's say, and the House, Republican. Now you have a certain kind of harmony. And the Speaker of the House can really reinforce the administration's policy priorities. And I have an example for you of Nancy Pelosi, again, but this is in 2019. During the government shutdown. So this is just 5 years ago, right? Nancy Pelosi's firm stance and control of the House agenda. So you have a House, because she's Speaker. The reason you know who's holding the House is based on who the Speaker is. And in this case, it's a Democrat. So this is in 2019. This is during the Trump administration. But the House was Democrat, I think. And so Nancy Pelosi's firm stance and control of the House were pivotal, ensuring that the majority party's priorities were kept at the forefront while navigating a polarized political landscape. So there you go. There's a good example of Nancy actually listening and modulating in a way to incorporate what it is that the majority party wanted, but that would also still work for the Democrats. That's really how government should work. Okay. The Speaker of the House, believe it or not, and we had some czars in yesterday's discussion, are really the one who enforces the rules and ideally strives for decorum. Now, it's the House members. There's way more House members than senators, and they are much more, how should we say, colorful than senators. To me, senators are just like a lawyer convention. I know they're not all lawyers, but man, it's like a lawyer convention in the Senate. That's where my dad wanted to be. He wanted to be a senator because they just want to argue, dispassionately argue things based on merit. There you go. There's the Senate. And the House, it's colorful. House is the House of Representatives. It's for the people, by the people. And so the Speaker is responsible for enforcing rules and procedures. And this story is about Newt Gingrich during the 1990s. That's Baby Bush, was known for his strict enforcement of House rules. And that order, the way he managed himself, his countenance, great word, his countenance was such that it helped him maintain order and push through a series of legislative reforms that were central to the Republican Party's agenda. When you see an administration have a lot of success, you can bet there's a strong Speaker of the House standing right there next to them. It happened for Obama. It happened for second baby Bush, and I'm pretty sure it happened for Bush Senior. When that alignment happens, things get done. It's not bad. Things do get done. And then, of course, the speaker enforces political strategy. So these are the things that aren't necessarily around the legislation, but that are around the priorities and what needs to happen. And sometimes political strategy could be a diversion. It doesn't matter. During the 2013 government shutdown, John Boehner faced criticism for not bringing a clean budget resolution to the floor. Instead, he prioritized his party's interest. His party was starting to gain momentum. This is 2013, right? At this point, you've got Obama has won his second election. So sometimes they're called lame ducks because they don't have another election coming up. And often there's turnover after an 8-year, after one party has the government for 8 years. It just depends on, I guess, their commitment to democracy, right? Anyway, John Boehner was faced criticism for not bringing a clean budget resolution to the floor, and he made it happen. He did it. He refused to find a compromise, and it really contributed to a prolonged gridlock. The speaker can also exacerbate polarization. So these are some negatives. They can really make it worse. As a partisan leader, they can be seen as a symbol of conflict. And for example, I mean, we've seen this from both parties for sure, where that Speaker of the House really becomes the bit of the lightning rod. Speaker Pelosi refused to hold a vote on President Trump's border wall funding in 2019, and that was seen as highly partisan, and it intensified the polarization, making it challenging to reach an agreement. In fact, right now, even our border legislation right now has been sent back to committee, which is a shame because we're not going to solve the border in one legislative bill. That's just not how it works. Legislation's a lot like sculpting, where you start to chip away and chip away and chip away. And at first you're just like, is that really going to be a human, a person? That sculpture is really going to be a person? Because you're just trying to get the form. Same with legislation. So when you really try to pass something that's horrible, you've really done our democracy a disservice. You've just made everything very complicated. And then, of course, it can be a really uncomfortable responsibility. And this is an example of where gerrymandering, when voters are gerrymandered and elections then become slanted because of how the gerrymandering has put people into a county or a precinct. That bubbles all the way up. Gerrymandering can lead to a situation where districts are heavily skewed, and then you get a house that is more extreme and less representative. So I'm going to bring up an example because I think I probably should have done the research, but I believe Marjorie Taylor Greene ran unopposed in her area. And it's also highly gerrymandered. And the problem is, I don't know why nobody else ran. Maybe nobody even thought about it. But we got somebody who is a representative, but probably somebody that in a more, a purist would say, if we really had run a candidate against her and they had actually had a debate and they actually had to ask their constituents what they cared about rather than tell them what they care about, we would see people who are less extreme in office. So gerrymandering can lead to more extreme humans who are less representative of the broader population. And this then undermines the speaker's ability to govern. In the 2012 elections, there was a lot of gerrymandering, and the Republicans retained control of the House. So 2012, that's Obama. There was tons of gerrymandering, and a lot of this has been undone now. Mark Elias's group has done a lot to try to get this gerrymandering undone so we can get back to the higher principles of democracy, where you just get one vote, one person, don't put them all together and make it skewed. This led to a more partisan House, and it made it incredibly difficult for Speaker Boehner to manage the competing factions within his party. So this is interesting because this goes right back to what I talked about at the top of this podcast, which is you have different caucuses within a party. And clearly in 2012, the Republicans were the victims of this fractured party because the gerrymandering brought in a lot of people who didn't have any experience, probably didn't even read the job description. I think so many people think somehow politics is a fast track to wealth, and it might be, but man, there's a lot more responsibility than just getting rich. And unfortunately, some people don't take the responsibility seriously on both sides. I'm going to say on all sides, everywhere. We always have flawed humans. Okay, so the big mission in being the Speaker of the House is to pass legislation based on doing the best for the American people. I'm going to make that up. I made that up. That's a high-minded mission. I'm not sure everybody agrees it's to do the best for the American people. In fact, I even have in my blog version of this script, you can decide if that includes corporations, because honestly, sometimes I feel like the legislation is really just based on what the corporations want, not what's best for us. But that's for another day. You sit with that. You think about that on your own. The Speaker of the House is there to ensure legislation is considered carefully. This is actually part of their job, but it is often balanced, and you can decide if the word balanced is right, with the demands of the majority party's agenda and the political realities of the time. So, right? You got it. Everything always happens in context. No matter what, you can have a high-minded ideal, but it happens in context, which was my Israel story about pragmatism. I mean, sometimes the context just requires pragmatism. While the Speaker doesn't typically draft legislation, they're crucial in deciding which bills are brought to the floor, and that involves coordinating with the committee chairs and the party leadership to ensure the bills are vetted, the amendments are considered, and the legislation aligns with the party platform and the nation's broader interest. Now, this is so important because this is a step we often miss these days because of social media, because we don't really have news where we think about things in a thoughtful way. We're just constantly bombarded with information now, so it's kind of messed up thinking about things critically, because that means you have to actually stop and then go seek more information. So as critical thinkers, the world has really pushed us to not do that. But I'm going to remind you that the Speaker does have a big responsibility to make sure legislation's ready to go, and that they really thought things through. And we are seeing a lot of rules. And I think it's NASA who just passed a no mask rule for everyone. Now that's a rule. That's not a policy, because it's not based on any thinking there. If it was a policy, they would have looked at both sides and really thought this through and thought about people who have chronic illness. And they would not have left. The reason you could tell this is a rule is they were so lazy that who decides if you're wearing the mask is an offense or is not an offense. And there is a little squish room in this law they passed. That's not a law, it's a rule that says you can just the person responsible for enforcing the crime are the police, and they can decide if they believe you if you say you're sick. I'm telling you, that is not a policy. That is not a repeatable thing. If you cannot repeat it with the same result, because you can't, a different police officer will make a different decision. And you can keep doing that all day long. But the point is, when you don't have a standard by which people can be measured, saying this is what sick is, that's how you can tell it's a bad law. It's just a bad law. And we need to hold our Speaker feet to the fire. We need to hold our Speaker's feet to the fire, because they need to bring laws to the floor that are thought through. Legally, policy-wise, infrastructure-wise, cost-wise. Can it merge with something else that's out there? Does it have to stand alone, or can we get some economies of scale? Will this really work everywhere? Or will this only work in states with sunlight? Like, there's so many ways you need to hard test policy and legislation before it's passed. And that really is the responsibility of the Speaker. Okay. So let me give you some examples where things have gone wonky. And I have two examples, but what I think is so cool about these two examples, because I pulled the examples first, but then I'm like, hey, how has history judged this? because we have that advantage when we go back and look, right? We can look at what happened at the time, but now we have this advantage of like, hey, 10 years later, let's see what happened. So let me give you two. I have two of our favorite, most recent speakers. One is from Speaker John Boehner. He faced criticism when his party fast-tracked the Budget Control Act of 2011. I have no idea what that was, but I just know this is during Obama's term. So let's get that. We got Boehner in the House. So we have two parties in opposition. The Budget Control Act of 2011 was another one to avoid national debt default. Just our typical, yeah, we're going to pay our creditors. I don't know why this is so hard. So he fast-tracked this Budget Control Act, and the move was seen as necessary to prevent an economic crisis. But some Republicans, his own team, argued that the legislation was rushed and didn't go far enough in cutting spending, leading to internal party conflict. Now, let's just leave it there, right? The party, they want more. The Republicans, I want more. I want more. But you know what? We also have pragmatism. So it got done. But I said, well, I wonder what the historical perspective was on this. And it was seen as a contentious but necessary compromise. And while it successfully averted a national debt default, the resulting sequestration cuts, what they ended up cutting, were widely criticized for their indiscriminate impact on defense and non-defense spending, leading to long-term challenges in funding essential government programs. Okay, so that's just a great example where somebody put their head down, powered through, but this thing, history judged it as a failure. So, and you may not have the benefit of being able to manage what you're doing so that history will judge it well. That may not be something that you can have at the time it happens. All of us have made mistakes because at the moment it happened, in the context we were standing in, we had to make a decision, and we made the best decision we could given the situation. That may be what happened here. And history judges differently because it's 10 years later. But I thought that was interesting to take a look back. And we can take a look at another one where Nancy Pelosi fast-tracked. This is in 2009. So this is the first year of Obama when the Democrats still had the House. So I think that's some of what the credit of the recovery. Remember the 2008 housing crisis? And we had to focus on recovery. So having the House and the presidency parties align allowed us to go faster. But let's see what happens here, because she fast-tracked the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This was a stimulus bill because of the housing crisis, right? It was designed to address the economic crisis. And while Democrats supported the urgent need for relief, some members of the Democratic Party and critics outside felt the bill was too rushed, and it led concerns that the legislation was not thoroughly vetted and included unnecessary spending. So remember what I said, you got to really vet that legislation. You need to know how the impact all over. Well, how does history judge what happened in 2009 and that American Recovery and Reinvestment Act? It's seen as a critical response to the Great Recession. And while it faced criticism for its size and the speed of its implementation, the act is credited with saving and creating millions of jobs and helping stabilize the economy during a severe downturn. However, opinions still are divided on its long-term effectiveness, with some arguing it contributed to the national debt, while others believe it laid groundwork for economic recovery. If I were doing something in history where it judged me, I kind of like that, because it said, yeah, you know what? It did what it needed to do. Remember, the context is everything. Got to make a decision in the moment. It did what it needed to do. Could it have done a better job? It looks like it absolutely could have. But in this case, this bill was rushed, but it saved people, Americans, from crashing. And that's really important. I mean, let's face it, that's super important. I think it's interesting because in 2009, I'm parenting. I'm not paying much attention to politics at that time. As much as I love it, I just wasn't. Especially 2009, Katie was 9 years old. She was born in 1999, so it's easy for me to always figure out her age. But I was so not paying attention. And I do know that I was surprised how well we turned around 2008, because it was bad. And I had a home and I knew it was bad. So it's interesting, you're listening to this podcast because you're interested in this kind of thing, but a lot of people just don't pay attention, including me during the parenting years. So I need to wrap up because this has gone long, but I find it so fascinating. And then you can tell, just come to me with the coffee shop and we'll just talk about this all day long. So the speaker's role reflects the broader challenges facing our democracy. It's always going to be an active, we talk about our democracy. It's a living, growing organism. It's changing all the time, and so is the role of the speaker. And it's highlighting the tension between leadership and the need for consensus, between representing the will of the majority and protecting the rights of the minority. That is like the essence of our being, right? How do I influence, and how do I also find a way to compromise? So I want to influence and compromise. I want to represent the will of the people, but I want to make sure I represent the will of the majority, but I got to protect the rights of the minority. That's who we are as a country. So we're going to head off into this week. We're going to see if the Speaker of the House, we've got they come back in session in September. This will be interesting. Watching the House in the next 2 months will be really interesting when they come back in September and October. I think we'll keep an eye on that, but let's see how they act. And now that you understand the role of the speaker, you can start to hold the speaker's feet to the fire a bit more. It's a big damn deal to have the job. It's not just something adorable. It's not cute or anything like that. It's a huge responsibility. And it's time that we hold people accountable for this job. So, we're going to keep talking about democracy. I would still love your feedback. I put that yesterday as a bumper on the front of my podcast. I would still love your feedback. Just send me an email. It's on my contact us page on my website. And I thank you so much for going on this journey with me. I will talk to you tomorrow. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Make sure you subscribe and rate, and I'll be back with another episode really soon.